With the commemorations of the centenary of the start of World War I now come and gone, preparations are now underway for the centenary of the landing of the Anzacs at Gallipoli, a day of some importance to how New Zealanders see themselves today and likely for the future. Although regarded as a seminal event in our national consciousness, as a military operation, the Gallipoli landings were an abject failure. Despite no lack of courage on the battlefield, the Anzacs were plagued by a lack of intelligence, ill-defined goals, and poor planning. They lacked sufficient material, artillery, maps, equipment, logistics. In short, the campaign was doomed to failure, not because of the character of the people involved, but the structure they found themselves working in. In 1988, the fourth Labour government commissioned businessman Alan Gibbs to chair a group tasked with evaluating New Zealand's public health service. In his report, Unshackling the Hospitals, report of the Hospital and Related Services Task Force, they identified the following problems as undermining the public hospital system. Firstly, the absence of relevant information with which to guide decision-making. Poor management. Underlying structural problems. Obstacles to access with regards to waiting lists for outpatient clinics, operations and long-stay beds. And the low morale plaguing the hospital system and discouraging initiatives for change. The ASMS papers, Time for Equality Agreement, and In Good Hands from 2008 and 2009, call for clinical governance, a focus on quality, and supportive relationships between managers and clinicians. Earlier this year, at an address to the Hospital and Community Dentistry Conference in Taupo, Ian Powell described the New Zealand health system as suffering from a neglect of workforce needs, intense financial pressures on DHBs, increasingly pervasive micromanagement, strengthening of a control and command leadership culture in DHBs, and an increasingly stifling environment in them that impedes both innovation and quality and financial performance and sustainability. We are also commemorating the 70th anniversary of World War II. 27 years after leaving Gallipoli, the New Zealand division was in Egypt, camped in the desert near El Alamein. Commanded by General Freyberg, a hero of the Gallipoli landings, they had known 2 years of defeat. Greece, Crete, Libya, Tunisia, and now possibly even Egypt. Meanwhile, their superiors in Cairo were preparing for the next withdrawal. On the 10th of August 1941, General Montgomery arrived in Cairo to take command of the British 8th Army. 3 days later, he had selected a new command team and had taken control. At a briefing of his officers, he issued an order that in the event of an enemy attack, there would be no withdrawal. We will fight on the ground we now hold, and if we cannot stay here alive, we will stay here dead. 18 days later, the Axis army failed in its last attempt to break through to Cairo and was defeated below the Elam Haifa Ridge. By the 4th of November, the Battle of El Alamein had been won, and the New Zealand division was pursuing the remnants of the Axis army back through Egypt into Libya. The, quote, brave but baffled 8th Army had been provided with leadership it could believe in, a clear long-term strategy communicated to and understood by all members of the organisation, and the resources they needed to achieve victory. A pattern of success had been set in motion that would take the New Zealanders to Trieste and the Allied armies to total victory and the establishment of the world order we now live in. Leadership makes a difference. Today, our health system faces the following challenges. We know that our population is going to age, and that this ageing population will become increasingly expensive to look after. We are facing an emerging epidemic of chronic non-communicable diseases with significant morbidity, such as dementia, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and depression. The rise of new and expensive medical technologies mean we'll be able to provide ever-increasing treatments, but at ever-increasing cost and public expectation. Climate change will result in an increased frequency of natural disasters and epidemics, with those most at risk of suffering the least able to cope. Globalisation, in fact, hyper-globalisation of labour markets means that New Zealand will continue to have to compete with the richest countries in the world to find the health professionals to staff our system. All of this together means that the crucial question for healthcare provision heading into the next 25 years is how it can be financed. If you look at trends in New Zealand, healthcare costs have roughly doubled over the past half century, from about 3.1% of GDP in 1950 to about 6.9% in 2011. This trend, I understand, is replicated across the OECD and in the NHS. Treasury predicts public healthcare spending will increase to 10.7% of GDP under their best case scenario in 2050, or up to 12.6% of GDP under their cost pressure scenario. The New Zealand Institute of Economic Research paints an even gloomier picture. They estimate that we have up to about 8 years to make a change to spending patterns before health costs start to impact the government's ability to keep its budget within its means. The ageing population is widely regarded across the world as the main driver of rising healthcare costs. And on the face of it, this certainly appears to fit with my very limited experience as a clinician. I've just come off a general medical run, and by and large, the older my patients are, the more comorbidities they tend to have. COPD, diabetes, ischemic heart disease, and so on and so forth. To me, their hospital stays appear to be both greater in frequency and in complexity compared to their younger peers. Running the numbers, however, reveals a different story. Estimates from Treasury suggest that demographic factors, read ageing population, contributed somewhere between only 6 to 9% of the increases in healthcare costs seen in New Zealand over the past 50 years. A trend I also understand is replicated across the OECD. So what wonderful things might technology hold for the practice of medicine, and how significant might they be? My initial thoughts about breakthroughs in medicine over the next 25 years were limited to new medical technologies and interventions, such as advances in stem cell technology, better utilisation of genomics and epigenetics, the development of personalised medicine, 3D printing of organs, and so on and so forth. Further reading on the subject matter brought me to artificial intelligence and the application of the internet, remote monitoring, and big data on medicine. Are any of you familiar with the TV show Jeopardy? Yes, to one of you there. For those of you who are not, which was me too until not that long ago, it's basically a back-to-front quiz show where contestants are given general knowledge clues in the form of answers and are expected to find the correct question to the clue they were given. Watson, a supercomputer developed by IBM, recently and quite famously bet 2 human champions at Jeopardy and is now being taught to process medical literature in order to make medical diagnoses and formulate treatment plans. What's amazing about Watson is that it is able to process unstructured data in prose form, say from a medical journal or from a patient's case notes, at a rate much faster than you and I could, and turn it into a diagnosis and treatment plan with its own uncertainty calculations for every recommendation it makes. Thus, the proliferation of electronic medical records and the growing wealth of data emerging from clinical and biomedical trials, together with the development of means to measure vital signs remotely, you can measure your heart rate and blood pressure on your iPhone today, together represent an enormous and burgeoning body of data that could be used to improve healthcare provision and public health. Like how Google, Facebook, and various advertising companies use big data to help you find what you want to find, read by, on the internet, based on your patterns of searching habits, this data could be used to predict disease epidemics through to asthma attacks. And in fact, there's a company working on that now. The number of times internet users within a particular region say Google measles or influenza could be used to predict such outbreaks. Early warning scores, for example, are used across the world for inpatients to identify those most at risk. And in theory, you could, with remote monitoring technologies, extend that to identifying patients in the community most likely to go off. Or perhaps even those most likely to accrue non-communicable diseases based on their lifestyle habits. Perhaps those in the community with the propensity to diabetes Google sweets or pizza more than their peers. Thus, in 25 years' time, thanks to artificial intelligence and big data, the physician's role, as we know it, may be no longer. She, he may be replaced by a Watson of some description, made in Cupertino, San Francisco, that has taken your vital signs and a whole lot more from your iPhone 20-something rather or equivalent, and examined the entire body of biomedical literature on your signs and symptoms to come up with a personalised diagnosis and treatment plan, just for you, all via the internet. If anything, this automation might send you a text message independent of you even asking, telling you that you're about to say have a STEMI and you should take yourself to the nearest cath lab for a primary angioplasty. No doubt, some catchy advertisement for the newest antiplatelet agent by Pfizer or GSK will play as you find yourself doubled over with the anginal chest pain, sweating and diaphoretic as your myocardium starts to die off. But somebody's got to make a profit out of the technology, right? As an aside, the surgeons are unlikely to be immune from artificial intelligence either. Robotic-aided surgery is already quite big in parts of the United States, and robot surgeons may, in 25 years' time, replace human surgeons altogether. Thus, at first glance, the impact of artificial intelligence, big data, and the automation of healthcare is alluring. Human beings are fallible, prone to succumbing to bias and making errors, particularly when hungry, tired, angry, bursting to go to the toilet, or a combination thereof. Moreover, it's harder for us as individuals to keep up with the rapidly burgeoning scientific and biomedical literature. And thus, augmenting healthcare processes with artificial intelligence and information technologies may allow us to transcend human error and ensure that our practice remains constantly at the cutting edge. Closer monitoring of various vital statistics and blood markers together with remote monitoring technologies would allow for the development of huge meta-ecological data sets, paving the way forward for fantastic advances in public health and health promotion initiatives, whilst allowing for the management of more people in their homes. Nevertheless, the very same ethical issues involved in the use of big data in advertising are likely to apply to health also. Who owns the data? What about individual privacy? And how about the quality of the data that's being used in the analysis? Unfortunately, not everyone in New Zealand has access to the internet, let alone an iPhone or equivalent. Thus, an over-reliance on technologies such as big data and remote self-monitoring in the delivery of healthcare runs the risk of creating a disparity in health outcomes between the technological haves and the have-nots, increasing systemic disparities that already exist between the rich and the poor, the educated and the illiterate, and the minorities and the majority. The risk is that the fruits of big data may become a commodity that only the educated and the rich can afford to consume, understand, and respond to adequately. Self-monitoring devices, however, may become so cheap in the future that they become widely used to incentivise good health behaviours and health promotion. Patients who meet their target, blood pressure, blood sugar, weight, and so on, may be in line to receive incentives for being healthy. A little like how state is using smartphones to measure how well people drive in order to calculate their insurance premiums, but on a much larger scale. Such a system would put the onus on being healthy firmly on the individual. Notwithstanding the evidence to suggest that patients with internal loci of control and psychological autonomy tend to have better health outcomes, incentive-based measures for promoting health are underpinned by an insidious assumption. An assumption that the unhealthy are a burden to society by being irresponsible and thereby deserve to be punished for doing so. An over-reliance on personal responsibility also neglects the wealth of evidence that we have today pointing the finger at the impact of societal, social and socioeconomic factors, the proximal factors in Dahlgren and Whitehead, that drive systemic inequalities in health outcomes. And what about the fiscal applications of new technologies and technologies on healthcare costs? Quoting Treasury again, they suggest that a quarter to a half of historical increases in healthcare spending could be attributable to new technologies, as public expectation of what healthcare and the healthcare system can deliver to us rises in tandem with new medical technology. Watson's diagnostic prowess and big data technologies may lead to the use of more diagnostic tests in medicine, whilst new medical technologies may open up a veritable Pandora's box of new and expensive interventions that widen the scope of what we can do for patients. If we look at the drivers of the greatest gains in life expectancy over the past few centuries, however, they have all been peripheral to the practice of medicine. Access to clean water, better sanitation, better diets, dry housing, and so on. The incidence and mortality of tuberculosis is the classic example. Most of the life expectancy gains from TB occurred well before the use of effective anti-TB agents. And finally, doctoring is so much more than the nuts and bolts of diagnosis and treatment and the biomechanical paradigm of medicine. Doctors do a lot more than diagnose, prescribe and cut. And indeed, if one looks at complaints to the Health and Disability Commissioner, the vast majority of these concern the kanohi te kanohi. That is, what occurs face-to-face with patients. In other words, communication. Continuing on the theme of demand-side drivers of healthcare costs, what of climate change? Costello et al. In The Lancet in 2009 described climate change as the greatest health threat of the 21st century, in the sense that those most likely to be affected are likely to be those least equipped to cope. And at the same time, we may be coming to the end of the great era of antibiotics, which happened to start around 1944 with the first widespread use of penicillin. The end of useful antibiotics might mean a return to the bad old days where post-operative infections were commonly fatal and pneumonia killed in droves. Let me put all of this together by sharing with you a conversation I had with one of my consultants. When this consultant started work at this DHB about 15 years ago, there were 6 medical registrars for the entire hospital. 2 for the older persons rehabilitation service, 2 for cardiology, and 2 for general medicine, as well as a house surgeon for each registrar. The catchment for the DHB at that stage was approximately the same as for today, and yet today there are almost twice as many registrars and house surgeons for the same number of patients. In the space of this consultant's practicing career, he had witnessed the computerisation and digitalisation of the health service, the sequencing of the human genome, the rise of evidence-based medicine, and the development of a swathe of new medical technologies to prolong patients' lives and to ease their sufferings. Nevertheless, in that 15-year time period, the labour requirement, in terms of doctors at least, to deliver a socially acceptable level of healthcare to roughly the same number of people roughly doubled, whilst the rate of increase in healthcare expenditure grew at a rate roughly double of New Zealand's growth in GDP. As incomes in New Zealand and across the world have risen, technological advances in medicine have increased what we can do for patients and what patients expect from the health system. This anecdote nicely demonstrates Baumol's cost disease as it applies to health. Over time, the average productivity of an economy tends to increase. Industries amenable to automation and technological capital, such as manufacturing and agriculture, tend to create above-average increases in productivity, leading to higher real wages. It follows that if there are industries in the economy that are performing better than average, there must also be industries where productivity rises more slowly. These are industries less amenable to automation and technology, labour-intensive industries, or those that deliver highly personalised or tailored services to the individuals who use them. These tend to have relatively poorer productivity growth. The arts is a classic example. It still takes as many personnels today to produce a Mozart quintet as it did 250 years ago. In health, there are only so many patients a single nurse can nurse with care and compassion at any one given time. Likewise, there are only so many patients a doctor can see in a single day, in a manner consistent with the Code of Rights of the Health and Disability Commissioner Act. Education is also another example. Class sizes have remained relatively static over the last few decades. The problem with having parts of the economy with relatively high productivity growth together with those with relatively low productivity growth is that wages in the less productive sectors of society need to keep up with wages in other parts of the economy. Otherwise, it would become increasingly more difficult to find people to become classical musicians, healthcare workers, or teachers. Since the cost of delivering, say, classical music, healthcare, or education will tend to rise relative to productivity, the price of delivering these services will have to rise in real terms. This is Baumol's cost disease. The corollary of this is that healthcare will consume a greater and greater proportion of a country's GDP as its productivity growth continues to fall behind the more productive sectors of the economy. I've sort of roughly demonstrated that in my anecdote about my consultant. Given that 60 to 70% of the costs of running the healthcare system is in employing labour, and that we are competing on a global market for doctors and nurses, it is no wonder the DHBs are desperately trying to cut costs given the intense financial pressures they are under. Sounds gloomy, doesn't it? Baumol's cost disease, however, may have a silver lining. Whilst healthcare spending might rise considerably in the future as a product of increasing labour costs and patient expectation, the growing slice of the GDP it will consume will not be so worrying if GDP continues to rise at its current rate. Despite the cost and disease incurred by the labour-intensive health industry, the costs of goods and services produced in the more productive parts of the economy will be relatively less. Thus, together with a bigger overall economy, there would be relatively more to spend on everything else compared to today, for a much lower unit cost. Thus, health's cost disease ironically produces its own cure, if we can accept and allow the more productive parts of the economy to invest in the delivery of healthcare services. In summary, we can, we should, and are actually capable and will be capable of funding high-quality healthcare services in the next 25 years. Unless technology enables healthcare delivery to be significantly less labour-intensive and public expectations of healthcare change significantly in line with this, in my opinion, technology is unlikely to provide the answer to increasing healthcare costs in the next 25 years. Deciding how the financial question will be resolved is ultimately a political choice. By how and how much healthcare costs grow is not as important as how the public and governments respond to the ever-increasing financial pressures on healthcare delivery. My key prediction for the next 25 years is that irrespective of the impacts of ageing, technology and so on and so forth, or what we can deliver as healthcare professionals, is that health and healthcare funding will become increasingly politicised. So what options do we have when it comes to responding to the challenges of how to finance growing healthcare costs over the next 25 years? The option most commonly talked about now is to cut costs and end the universalism of the health system. In 2009, an article in the Sunday Star Times based on a report entitled "Health, New Zealand's Untreated Addiction" made headlines. Earlier on this year, a think tank organised by Southern Cross on this very issue recommended introducing more user charges for some, if not all, treatments, introducing tax breaks on health insurance premiums, educating the public on personal health responsibility, and reducing the universality of free healthcare by refocusing on those in greatest need, to name a few. I predict that the combination of cost-cutting and the growing politicisation of health will result in a decrease in the level of healthcare available to the population as a whole, and create huge social tensions, both across society and within the medical profession. Beaumont has shown us that cutting costs today will do nothing to cut healthcare costs tomorrow, as squeezing productivity gains from the labour-intensive health sector is virtually impossible, and because we're competing on a global market with the richest countries in the world for the doctors and nurses to staff our system. Nor will cutting costs have any effect on curbing the growing expectations in the public of what we can do for our patients. There is, however, an alternative. We can create a health system based on well-being rather than simply just the treatment of disease, with health professionals and the wider public working together to address the total range of health determinants. My vision is of a health system that values the humanistic rather than the technologic, one that recognises the value of a patient as a human being. A health system by the people, for the people. It is of a health system that is steadfastly universal, well-funded and primarily primary, as opposed to tertiary. It is of a health system that utilises evidence-based medicine and clinical governance in everyday practice and is unwaveringly patient-centred. It is of a health system and a health workforce that works together with patients towards bringing New Zealand back to being God's own. A country with a progressive, egalitarian and equitable society with the right combination of policies to address the total range of health determinants. Achieving this vision will necessitate doctors moving beyond the patriarchal treatment paradigm to become, or perhaps return to, being advocates for the promotion of their patients' health and well-being, developing leadership the health sector and the public can believe in. Like all health professionals, nurses, physios, speech language therapists, social workers, we each have a professional duty to promote the health and well-being of all New Zealanders. Though it may not feel like it, as New Zealand's preeminent and senior medical professionals, the ASMS and medical specialists are uniquely placed to influence the public discourse around health. If we can contribute to the public discourse around health, its determinants and healthcare spending, we can convince governments to make the changes necessary to bring about this vision for the health system. Creating this discourse over the next 25 years will require you and the health workforce to be better able to communicate the essentials of medical science, health promotion and the sustainability of the health system with the wider public. It will also require a profession more representative of wider society. Steps therefore need to be taken to foster greater involvement of doctors in the communities they serve. This will require more community involvement in the training of doctors and the values medical schools seek to instil in their graduates. Medical training at both the undergraduate and postgraduate levels will therefore need to be more cognizant of both the needs of women, people from different cultural backgrounds, and the drivers of health needs of communities. Creating a medical profession more representative of wider society and developing leadership people can believe in will also require that we keep our doctors, particularly you, our specialists, here in New Zealand. In a world of opportunities, there has to be a compelling reason for us to continue to work in New Zealand. The economic realities of the global economy and Beaumont's cost disease indicate that financial reward is unlikely to provide that reason for the foreseeable future. Other economies and systems to which we will have access offer significantly higher rates of remuneration. There has to be another reason. For New Zealand to continue to retain doctors of all descriptions, it needs to offer different rewards. Fortunately, a price cannot be put on the professional satisfaction of working in a truly functioning health system and making a meaningful contribution to society. Our task is to ensure we continue to have a health system that we want to work in and to return to. A profession we are proud to belong to, and a society we want to live in. Today, as in 1941, leadership makes a difference. The future is not a place we travel to, it is a reality we make in our own choices and actions today. If we don't act, others will. The future of medicine in New Zealand is here, in this room today.